What is up, y'all, and welcome back to our final tier list video. And you notice the tier list looking a little different. And I just want to shout out the folks who sent some really helpful feedback about how the tier list was looking, and that it was just a little bit harder to tell like who really was on top in the tier list, because I think it is pretty close right now. But I've also had a little bit more time to kind of reflect on these videos and how clear it is. So we did reorganize the tier list a bit. We still got 5 planeswalkers to go. We're going to cover those tonight. But just on our to-do list, I'm going to go through a little bit of my logic for how I reorganized this tier list. And please give me feedback about if this felt a little bit more clear. Fingers crossed. I'm thinking for at least a few viewers that it will be. And I'm going to give some other folks shout-outs throughout the video who were looking forward to some of these planeswalkers. Some of them are going to come up okay. I think others might not be so happy about the feedback on if their planeswalker is playable. But again, it's early stages. We'll be 2 weeks into the patch as of Monday. I'm recording this as of Friday, which y'all will see as soon as possible. And again, just thank you all for your thoughts and comments and all that good stuff. Please keep hitting that like and subscribe button and that comment button. Just want to keep hearing from you folks. So first, we'll get into this and then we'll dive into the planeswalkers. I felt like A-list, A-tier just needed to be the decks that are the decks to beat, the decks that are shaping the format. I think specifically Domri over here, of course, and Nahiri are shaping the format. They are the best kind of aggro mid-range options out of anyone. I've really just continued to come up on Nahiri. I think that she is really, really strong with what she's doing. And I think Nissa has a million ways to build her deck and can really tune to some of the best aggressive mid-range strategies. And Vraska, I think, just, although it feels like a very fair deck, it just addresses a lot of what, especially the aggressive decks, are doing really, really well. So I feel like these are going to be, although I would guess people are seeing Domri and Nahiri more, maybe not so much Nissa and Vraska, depending on what rank you are. You're going to see more and more of them as we respond to this aggressive meta, and I think they're all four of them. If I gave you the deck list, I think you would do well. B tier is going to be, above average, right? So still winning games, still having a positive win rate, but definitely going to struggle with some of the more powerful strategies, right? I do think that Liliana still has a lot of decent answers to aggro and mid-range in particular. I do think that Vivian, Angrath, and Kiora are a little bit more, I think, just serviceable and a little bit more effective than what Chandra might be doing. And I think Teferi and Rel, although can still be positive and still be powerful, they both got nerfed in this patch, and I just want to acknowledge that I do think that they are not the A-tier strategies that they once were. So I hope that this visual is a little bit more helpful with that. And I think Ajani, Gambling, and Sarah are all still average decks. I think you can have 55 to 60% win rate with them. I would not be surprised if Yanling comes up a little bit more as an aggro strategy as things shift around, because I think evasion and card advantage are a pretty solid strategy to have in an aggro deck as opposed to just completely going for the face. But I do think that she still needs quite a lot of fine-tuning to get there. And Sarah, unfortunately, I just don't really like her as an aggro option, and I think even as a control option, I think I would recommend more control strategies like Teferi, and sort of like Kiora, although Kiora is more of like a mid-range ramp deck. But she kind of plays like control in some ways. And then, of course, we've got our sad, lonely vampire at D tier. I want to shout out Karma, who's someone that hopefully will be having a coaching video pretty soon, so a little preview of that, a little spoiler, who was just like, yeah, I just think that you might even need to show that this vampire is really, really, on the bottom of the barrel. So I just thought that would help to make things a little bit more clear. So that is my process with how we reorganize this, and I hope that this is a bit more helpful, especially for newer players who are, not really accounting for 20 planeswalkers worth of different deck interactions and all of that. So, shout out to all of you who are always helping me become a better content creator. So thank you so much. And let's get into our first deck tonight. And it is an old favorite of mine, and that is Kaya. I think that she was one of the first aggro decks that I picked up and really enjoyed. So we're going to start with that build, but I'm going to give a shout out to Patrick Snyder, I believe it is. Patrick, thank you for, putting your deck list out there and sort of showing like, hey, I think Kaya control is also a thing. I didn't post your exact deck list here, but for anyone who wants to check that out, that's on, I believe, tier list 2 of the 4 videos total that we'll have in the last week, so check that out. I do have a shout out to it in the fact that Monman, who recently joined our team, excellent player, always at the top of the ladder, they had, have this kind of pet control Kaya deck, so I am going to showcase that because I think that's just a fun, interesting way to play Kaya that not everyone might be thinking about. So, what are we talking when we talk Kaya aggro? This is my favorite way to build this deck, and although I do think there are some different tweaks, generally I've been really pleased with this, and I think you will hit Mythic with it. I do think that you will struggle in Mythic against some of the top tier strategies. I do think that it's a pretty good matchup on the other side for Domri, for Nahiri, for Vraska. I think it's close, but probably Vraska favored. And I think against Nissa, it really just matters on what they're building. If they are truly a much more kind of ramp-heavy, higher curve, you could definitely snag some wins with this deck, because if they're not interacting with you that much early, even though they're gaining a lot of incidental life, you're just getting a lot of cards. You're getting a lot of value on your evasive creatures, and as long as you're able to kind of race out the lava wave or some of the other interaction, I think it can do well. So I already want you all to be kind of thinking in this conversation that Kaya is not a top tier strategy, but she can get wins. You can have a positive win rate with her, and I think she can get you to Mythic, which I think probably already we should be thinking about B and C tier for that. So we'll kind of go over that later. But if you haven't really played with this Planeswalker, this is my favorite build. I really think that Hellmouth Cave does an insane amount of work in this deck. Having your curve, yes, really only go up to 3, so Hellmouth is not really interrupting your plan, might seem like a huge concession, but it's just not. I mean, most of the time, what you need to be doing is playing Silent Prowler turn 1, and then pumping it with Invoke the Dawn, or after you attack, you can cut down, or Devoted Steed. You really just want to be completing missions, because every time you complete a mission, although the missions get 1 damage higher, so they're a little bit harder, you're just getting so much card advantage. I cut some other cards from former lists that I had worked with, and I just want to play as many effective 1-drops that are evasive as possible, and the same goes for 2-drops, although a card that I definitely come off a little bit is Detonator. I think it's a mid-range lists, or rather aggro lists, although it can fight a little bit with mid-range, but it's really a card that I thought was pretty effective into aggro matchups because it's just got 4 toughness, but the reality is we've got to deal with Blitzing Minotaur that has 4 power now. It comes down on turn 3. So I do think I would recommend a different 2-drop over Detonator. So really quick, let me just actually see what I would want to replace with that. I had been thinking about this before the video, but quite honestly, I forgot. So I think there are plenty of solid 2-drops. I definitely have not felt that Fiend is the best option, but I think it is an option. And I think in an aggro meta, you just want to be thinking about how can I get the most bang for my buck? How can I accrue card advantage or just be, racing my opponent? And I think probably the card that I would be happiest to play is probably just Counterfeiter. Again, it's a sneak card. It's also just solid card advantage. So I think that's the card that I would probably replace. You can try Detonator, though. I think sometimes it's pretty solid in the aggro matchups, but I do think that's the change I would make. And I'm not going to go through everything because I want to consider people's time. I think that the basics of this deck are pretty clear. You're just trying to complete your missions the best you can. And I think, standout cards, Stoneforge Mystic allows you to really close the door. Glorious Anthem and Scathing Glare in particular because of how cheap they are and how cheap your flying creatures are and your other evasive creatures with sneak. You just get a lot of mileage out of Scathing Glare and Glorious Anthem. And when you have cut down, this deck feels like you're really greasing the wheels, because you're just allowing yourself to cut down some of their smaller creatures if you need to, or you're dealing damage with them to help complete your missions. And I do think that this is a pretty solid option as an aggro deck, and personally, I really, really like this play style. So if you like that kind of aggro tempo, card advantage play style, I think that Kaya is a really, really good option for that. But I do want to move on, because I'd like to shout out this deck real quick. Take a sip of water while y'all peruse. So, what is Kaya Control doing? Right? You're running Sacred Sanctum, which I'd seen people do at some point when I was playing Kaya early on. And I was like, well, why are we doing that? And the answer is, White has some really, really great options for kind of gumming up the board, gaining life, and slowing the tempo of the game very effectively. And this is a list from Monman again, who's really, this is kind of their pet deck. And I can see the appeal. There's an incredible amount of card advantage that can be generated from this deck. I'm definitely missing stuff, but I do think that this is a fun option for her. It's hard for me to gauge how good it is, but if Monman has gone to Mythic with it, then I think it's worth considering. And who knows, maybe it is a good way to really address the meta. Full disclosure, I've not played a ton of games with this deck, but I do think it's worth a shot if you're interested in trying something new with Kaya. So I think right away, Infest is a pretty important card in the format. So can Power Word Stoneby. Moon Silver Shackle actually does quite a lot of work just for 3 mana. And you've got Second Sun's Dawn and Day of Judgment package to really slow down what the aggressive decks are doing. You've got stuff to gum up the board. I think Leonin Healer is probably one of the best 2-drops you can be playing in an aggro meta, so you've got that going for you. You've got cards that can maybe trade, obviously, 1-for-1 and then draw you a card, or Infectious Scorpion to get those dooms. It's even running Fatal Affection as just like a really, really cheap, okay, as long as I can use my life total as a resource, I'm going to be able to kill your creature. And I think, that also goes for Eminent Archangel, right, which you could slam after you've taken some damage and gained some of that life back. And Gristlebrand, this thing, when you can really grab it off of your Fiend Fanatic, and I think Fiend Fanatic, does it get anything else in the deck? I think it does hit Koth, which is cool, and it hits Death Shadow. So I do think that Fiend Fanatic is like a really interesting card, and Death Shadow is kind of a no-brainer, because like you're gaining a lot of life, but then you're taking a lot of damage, and Death Shadow just cares about how much damage you've taken. And obviously it's going to come down and be absolutely monstrous. And so you can, Day of Judgment and then play your Death Shadow that's been discounted, from all the damage that you've taken. So I think this is worth a shot. And overall, if we hop over to our handy-dandy tier list, I think I am going to put Kaya in C tier. Now, I really do like Kaya quite a bit, but I do think that, unfortunately, she's just not the best aggro option. In fact, she's not even in the top 3 aggro options. Top 4 if we count Domri as a part of that. I think Domri, Nahiri, Angrath, and Chandra all have a better shot at getting you as many trophies over Kaya. But again, although these Planeswalkers are in the C tier, I won't speak for Soren, but the C tier, you can still get to Mythic, right? You can still grind those games out, and if you really know your matchups, you're going to get wins, right? So just, I want everyone to not go away thinking, okay, C tier, I should never be playing those decks. If you like those Planeswalkers, work on it, right? Like, see what's best against the top tier decks. See if you can tech your deck to beat those decks, right? And a lot of times, I think you can in this game, and that's why I really love it, is that there are these, because we're playing best of one, there are some ways that you can kind of hedge your bets if you're seeing more of a certain Planeswalker. So that's where I'm putting Kaya. I feel pretty confident about it. And I think with that, let's also take a look at Gideon as our other aggro option that we have yet to talk about. And although I don't have, the most experience with this deck, I definitely put in a couple reps this week and found it to be serviceable. I don't know that this is the prime deck construction for Gideon, but I've really liked what this is doing. Obviously, you're playing Oath of the Paladin, and you're playing Fair Fight, right? Which just has that synergy of being able to Aura of Courage when all your creatures are 4/4s, and then they turn into 5/5s, so they just run over your opponent. You're playing cards that benefit from Paragon of Balance, right? That's definitely a strategy that we're running. We've got Thraben Sentry as an 0/3 armor, Fledgling Gryff, let's see, who else? Yeah, Silver Griffin, that all benefit. And honestly, I've really liked Raise the Guard as a way where you can just really easily get Gideon rolling. And, sometimes it just makes more sense and it's more efficient to get those soldiers down, and it's really easy for you to just kind of be beating down with Gideon. They're taking damage. And I do think that this card does quite a bit of work in the list. And with Aura of Courage and with Divine Smite, it's really nice to have a card that just generates 3 bodies to be pumped or to be used for Divine Smite. So I think it is worth a look. I do love the blue splash. I think Mana Constrictor, again, you're allowing your opponent who might be wanting to answer cheap threats, they become, 1 more expensive, which makes a difference. You're running Negate in that sort of classic aggro control style to, stop potential lava waves and other interaction early. And you're running Geist of Saint Traft, which I think is just like a pretty efficient card on its own, right? It's a 2-for-1. It's like a decent rate. And giving it armor, right, also helps it to be pretty solid. And then you've got Fair Fight. And you've got some fun stuff in like Sylvia Brightspear, right, where you could play Brightspear and then play Paragon later in the game, right? It just makes all their stuff 1/1s, which I do think is kind of an interesting combo when we think about going toe-to-toe with aggro. Or even mid-range. I think Sylvia Brightspear adds a little bit of an interesting angle to the deck. And I've been pretty pleased with Captain of the Guard. Getting a free body is very relevant when you're playing Gideon, because you really just want to be kind of throwing bodies at your opponent when you are able to proc Gideon, so you just always want to stay up on creatures, and Captain of the Guard just allows you to do that, for free. And also Captain of the Guard gets a bump from Paragon because it becomes a 6/6 instead of a 4/6. But it's also just kind of a serviceable body, in my opinion. I think this deck is a lot of fun. I really do enjoy playing it. I don't think it's one of the best aggro strategies, and that's why when we hop over to our handy-dandy tier list, I am going to put Gideon also in C tier. Again, it'll get you to Mythic. It will allow you to gain some trophies here and there, and, if Gideon maybe gets a little bit of love at some point, I do think that he could be, one of the better aggro strategies like he used to be. But he's really just been kind of out-muscled, in my opinion, especially by Nahiri, but also by Angrath and Chandra, who just really go for the throat in I think, a more efficient way. But the thing that Gideon has is the ability to play Mana Constrictor and Negate. And I just want to highlight how important that is, as well as Fair Fight, because Mana Constrictor and Negate can be really, really good into control. So, if we get to a meta where control is really finding their footing and really dealing with some of the green and red aggro decks more efficiently, Gideon actually might move up because you've got access to those blue interactive spells that can really make the difference. So that's kind of my caveat with Gideon. And why don't we talk about our last mid-range Planeswalker in Drizzt here before we go to the other 2 control folks at the end of the table here. All right, Drizzt. A lot of people's enemy, understandably. Let me throw up the deck list while I sip more water. Okay, there's a lot to talk about here. I'm, again, not going to go too in depth because I'm going to be mindful of the video length in this whole series. It's pretty long, so thank you for bearing with it. Back to Drizzt. I think that this is the core of how I've really liked playing Drizzt. It has quite honestly been a while since I was really grinding with this deck and really tuning it. But this is the deck construction that an old friend on the ladder, Zerashi, had worked on and iterated on, and I really, really came to love it. So let's go over kind of the core of the deck. Moorland Haunt is the best land. It's the best utilized land for this deck. I think Moorland Haunt belongs in this deck because of how many haste legendaries you're running that can be extremely relevant, or for debut creatures that's also extremely relevant. So I think Moorland Haunt is where we want to be, and we don't want to disrupt our curve. So obviously, it's a turn 6 land, which I think is appropriate because we're topping out at Ulrich. So I just really can't overstate. Sorry, still having allergies. How important it is that you can build your deck to accommodate your land, and that just really makes it a lot smoother, and a lot less variance will affect what you're doing. So, Invoke the Dawn, I think it's really good in Najani, but I think it's also really good in a deck that is trying to use its stats to continue to muscle through and build its Guinevere. And it's just a really efficient card for what we're doing. Daughter of Runes, giving your powerful legendary creatures armor is just really, really important. Matron of Malice, I think the main way that Drizzt wins is just snowballing Guinevere, right? It's just getting her pumped every single turn as much as you can. And Matron always has the potential to come back later when your opponents forget about it. But there are a couple other reasons why we play Matron, which we'll talk about. Traveler Supplies, I know some people are not really into this as a package, but I do think it just does a lot of work for this deck, because pumping your creatures that tend to be relatively powerful already, I think really can make a difference. Like, you're really trying to be mindful of the stats that you have so that you can attack with your legendary creatures, and potentially they're not just trading, right? And so they're getting in multiple attacks to pump Guinevere, and I think Travel Supplies is just really efficient for 1 mana. Birds of Paradise, I just think has been a solid card in the format in general, but I think in Drizzt what it does is, yes, it nets you a fragile mana gem to use later, but one of the most well-known combos is just Drizzt heralding your Birds of Paradise on turn 2, right? So that your Birds of Paradise, although it's not attacking for any damage, it is legendary, it's evasive, and it's getting your Guinevere rolling. So I think Birds still deserves to be here. And Pier, again, we're looking at, we've got 2 low curve legendary creatures, and Pier definitely can get pretty scary. And combined with Stoneforge Mystic, when you can upgrade it and potentially give it evasion, it gets really, really scary. And these legendaries just get the ball rolling on Guinevere. And that brings me to Alarm Bell. This card was definitely a lot better when it said draft, right? Because we got to try and pick either Pier or Matron of Malice early on, get the ball rolling, almost guaranteed. So, although Alarm Bell is now 2 mana to draw a random creature that costs 2, right? And we've got 2 Daughter of Runes, 1 Matron, 2 Birds, 1 Pier, right? So it's 6 total. We still have the chance, it's 2 or less. So then we've got Yenogu, Tarmogoyf, Infuser, and Drizzt Herald. So Herald's good early, Yenogu's good early, Pier, and Matron of Malice. So it's only 5 total cards, but it does thin your deck, right? It is taking out cards that you don't want later on, and it is pretty efficient for what it's doing. Honestly, the travel supply into Alarm Bell is kind of nice, right? Like, you're travel supplying, and then whatever you're drawing off of Alarm Bell is going to be buffed, and I do think it's worth it. And the reason we're running some of these low curve things is that Yenogu can be quite a beating. Think about, even if you're on the draw and you go like Daughter of Runes turn 1, Matron of Malice, right? Or Daughter of Runes, Birds of Paradise. This thing's coming in as a 6/6 trample haste on turn 2, right? So, like, that's pretty formidable. And I think Yenogu definitely deserves to be here. And because we're running artifacts, and we've got a trap and we've got some spells, we'd kind of be missing out if we didn't at least, run one of our favorite green creatures, Tarmogoyf. So, definitely one of the better decks to be running Tarmogoyf in. Really easy for this thing to be kind of massive and a bit of a problem. Elvish Infuser, I've always really liked in decks that are just always trying to push damage and are using their stats to get ahead. I think it does tremendous work when you get to buff your Yenogu for 2 toughness, or your Peer for 2 toughness, or even sometimes your Matron of Malice for 2 toughness, so it could attack through 2 power creatures. So I don't sleep on Elvish Infuser. I've really liked this card in a lot of different green-based decks, and I think it makes a lot of sense in Drizzt. Roach Match, pretty much nothing to explain there. Drizzt Herald, obviously. Stoneforge Mystic, still just always going to be one of the best, aggro and mid-range white cards. I think One Path to Exile feels right. It feels like it can be really helpful on pivotal turns to push through damage with your legendary creatures. One Worm's Wake, again, I think it's good. I don't think we really want to be counting on holding this up that much. Hero's Call, I think as one of, is correct. Being able to draft an additional legendary and kind of craft the rest of your game plan based around what you hit, I think can be inherently very powerful. Armadillo Cloak, being able to attack with your Yenogu and they're trying to block it and whittle it down, and then you just go, I'm going to give it +2/+2 ward and fully heal it. Armadillo Cloak can be really, really strong, and I encourage you to at least try it as a 1-0. And then these 3 don't really bear any explaining, but Zozu, Haste Legendary, Tajik, Haste Legendary, Ulrich, Haste Legendary. So that's why we're running them. And although this definitely requires you to have quite a bit of cards, if you can build this deck, I think you should try it. And I think, again, is it the best aggro strategy? No. Is it the best mid-range strategy? No. But this is also a deck that you can tune and you can tweak, and I think you can get edges when you normally couldn't. And especially if we ever get closer to a control meta, I think that Drizzt can be really, really oppressive. So when we go over to our tier list, as we're getting close to the end here, again, I think that we should be putting him in C tier. He can get those wins, but he's just not doing what these other decks are doing as well as they can. And it's possible that Drizzt is a little bit more stronger than these 2 aggro options, but I think it's, for now, I feel fine kind of leaving him here at the end of C tier, because I think sometimes the Johnny's just a little bit better at what he's doing. I think Yanling's got an interesting dimension to her, and Sarah also has some interesting deck building. And then I think these aggro decks, like, when you build the decks appropriately, I think they're very straightforward and they do what they're supposed to do. Drizzt takes a little bit more time, I think, to get really, really finely tuned. So that leaves us with 2 Planeswalkers to go. Thank you all for sticking with it. As we wrap up today, again, I want to thank everyone for all their support, and please just let me know what else I can be doing on this channel to make this game even more enjoyable and more interesting for you. So that's my last plug before we close out here. Let me grab some water just to reflect on this tier list together. Okay. I'm going to go with Ashiok here because I want to end on an interesting note with Jayce. Alright, here's what I think about Ashiok. I lost an easy 60 points playing Ashiok today, so it was against all aggro opponents, and I just don't think Ashiok has enough gas in the early game to match what every really strong aggro deck is doing, and I'm just going to throw it out there that I really think Ashiok is probably one of the lowest on the tier list, besides Sorin. But I think if I was going to build the deck, I think this is roughly what I would do after having played a bit of games today and sort of iterating on it. I do think that School of the Wizard has always just been, one of the better class cards to be playing. Runeshell Crab is very good right now. It is really important for gumming up the ground and being able to answer things like Blitzing Minotaur, right, effectively. They're playing a 3-drop, your 1-drop answers it. That's great. I played some other cards in the list, but the more I played against aggro, the more I was like, wow, I need Break-a-Legs in here, I need Grave Disturbance, I need things that are just cheap and really, stopping my opponent from playing like 4-3s and 3-3s and, 5-4s that are really just coming down super, super hard on what I'm doing and potentially disrupting, armor creatures with stuff like Break the Leg or different debut creatures. And then I think your 2-drop package, I think Neurobot's interesting over the other one just because it's a random blue card instead of a random blue spell. So I just think, okay, you might want to see a larger pool of cards off of Neurobot. Isochron Scepter has always been really good. Winter Grip Mage, I think it's fine, but it's it's not answering the 4 and 3 power creatures, and that's something I'm a little worried about. Same thing with Scorpion. I think you kind of have to play Transparent Hallway. Like a 3/6 stat line is really important for getting 2 blocks off. Although it's pretty transparent what you're doing. I see what I did there. I think it's still really necessary. Agony Warp, I think, again, you're generating a Nightmare, right, because it's giving you another free card. And I think Agony Warp is actually pretty efficient right now in the meta. And then you go to your really, your staples, right? Shell Game, Infest, Shadow Stag. Shadow Stag I've gone back and forth on, but I think you get enough value out of it. Mist Raven, I think I really like just because of the tempo ability, right? Just being able to bounce your opponent's creatures and put a body on the board, I do think is really necessary in the meta. Change Teams I was testing, I kind of like it as this like weird unconditional answer to something. Like this was kind of a nod to stuff like, other mid-range decks or like Liliana in particular, right? You just like nab their creature and put it in your deck. Which I think is kind of an interesting one of. Master of Possibilities, I think, is like one of the more efficient 6-drops you can be playing, right? You're getting to draft a spell and then play it for 0. It's a 4/4 for 6 mana, which is, below rate, but getting that free, potentially impactful spell I think is good. Wrong Turn I wanted to test, and although I got screwed on it once or twice, like it just didn't really work out the way I wanted it to, I think it's worth a look. It got buffed in the patch, and, paying 2 mana to destroy a creature honestly might be good enough. Maybe this should be a 2 of. But I think I definitely wanted to try it at least a 1 of, and I think it has some potential. And then Scour the Void, I think, is the highest kind of cost endgame card you could be playing, just with how aggressive this meta is. Like, I had Arcanus in here, and I was like, I'm not making it to turn 8 and stabilizing with this card. Like, I'm basically almost dead by turn 8 half the time, even when I'm trying to tune this deck. So I think Scour the Void is kind of the highest mana cost I can really go with how just efficient these aggro and mid-range decks are right now. So this is kind of how I would look at Ashiok, and I'm not running any land other than Underground Sea. I think you have to hit your land drops, and you have to be having the most efficient turns at the beginning of the game. So if you're an Ashiok player and if you're trying to be as competitive as possible, this is where I would start. I think there are definitely ways you can tune it, but I think if you're trying to beat aggro, this is pretty close to the list that I think we should be playing. Maybe, one more Wrong Turn over like Change Teams, or, over potentially Shadow Stag, or maybe we don't even play Scour the Void. But I think that this can win games, but as we go over this tier list, because I didn't want to end on too a sour note, I do think that Ashiok and sadly Sorin are still on the bottom here, and I with a little bit more testing, I think maybe Ashiok would be better than Sorin, but honestly right now, I guess if I had to choose between the two, I would probably rather play Sorin. I just think Ashiok just doesn't quite have what she needs in the early game to match these other decks. Well, alright, we're almost there. This last deck is going to be Jayce, and I am taking this at the word of another teammate, that this deck is playable, that it is pretty solid, and I am going to put it in either B or C tier, but I wanted to show folks, God, at the cost of, influencing the meta, I'm a little worried about talking about this deck because I have such PTSD from Laboratory Maniac Jayce, but that is what we're going to talk about, and I hope the deck title kind of says it all. Yuck, but okay. I get that some people really like playing this strategy, so I'm going to say yuck for me, but maybe this is something you like, and this is a build that our teammates have been working on, and I really have I'm taking their assurance that this is a deck that is worth exploring if you do like this kind of playstyle with Jayce. Now, I think Jayce splashing white could just be better, right? Just as the kind of staple, you've got sweepers, you've got defensive options, then I guess you end the game with an Arcanus, right, or something like that, or maybe you play Sun Titan, I don't know. Maybe there's some room there, and you win the game. But, this is a deck that has a lot of early interaction. It has a lot of ways of, kind of gumming up the board. and extending the turns of the games. And, you know, although I don't think it's top tier, I do want to throw it as an option for Jayce. So you're running, you know, Tolarian Academy, you've got Thought Provoker, you've got, what else? Sylvan Shrine, right, which is kind of the main one, Wizard Spellbook. But, you know, this is basically Jayce ramp to then, you know, protect your Maniac off of Wielder of Waves, right, give a friendly creature ward, and just hope that you can win through that. I don't really like that strategy personally, but I have it on shirts that it's good. So this is a Jayce deck that I at least wanted to showcase here for folks who are interested in this kind of build. And, you know, I think the interaction between Wielder of Waves and some of what you're doing can be pretty powerful, and you will churn through your deck. You've got Mana Constrictor, Crab, and Birds of Paradise to ramp and sort of for off of Paradise and to come up the ground. You've got a lot of interaction and negate, remand, and anticipate to find what you need. You got Divination, Repulse, of course, to draw you those cards. Wielder of Waves to protect your Laboratory Maniac and potentially be a solid blocker. And you've got tons of ways to draw cards and reset your mana. So I think that I just was not going to play this deck too much because I'm just frankly not interested in playing a Laboratory Maniac, but I'm sure there are players that do really enjoy this kind of style of gameplay. So that is at least this build of Jayce. And then I think I had this is like, you know, kind of a rough Jayce list, right? You're kind of like mimicking Teferi, which is why like probably you should just be playing Teferi instead of playing Jayce. But Jayce does have some upside, you know, in the control mirror. And I do think there are other ways to play Jayce. You could play red with Hellion. You know, that's a potential way to close out the game. But I think, you know, a deck list like this, and I'll put all of these deck codes as much as I could fit, hopefully, in the description. But I think this is totally serviceable as a Jayce deck. And I think Jayce just, you know, has never really appealed to me in this game. So, you know, I just don't have that much experience with him. But as we close out today, I think where I would put Jayce is probably kind of somewhere in the middle here. I think that Jayce probably has a little bit of a better shot in the meta than some of the aggro decks to some degree. And I think C tier seems appropriate. Maybe B tier is where they might end up if you tune the deck a little bit. But I do think out of the, you know, really the other premier control deck being Teferi, to me it's quite noticeable how much better Teferi is at controlling the board. That's just how I have traditionally felt. And then Ashiok's not really even a part of the conversation as a control deck because it's not that she's not a control deck, but she kind of operates a little bit differently, and I just think she's head and shoulders not able to deal with what the meta is dealing with, is sort of pumping out right now. So this, finally, is our tier list. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Again, this is just my personal view, and having, you know, played and collected some information from teammates and sort of chatted about all this. I hope this is helpful. I really do think this is as close as I can get to really trying to, you know, have these different categories of the tier list. And I think, who knows, maybe toward the end of the month or even in a week or two, we'll kind of come back and look at this tier list and maybe just talk about what's shifted. So that's all I got for you folks today. Thank you so much for sticking with it. We're over 100 subscribers, which is just such a cool and exciting thing. I'm going to have that Discord coming to y'all real soon, so stick with me and let me know what else we can work on together. Because here we truly are a community, and I want to hear what would be helpful for folks and what's really just going to add, you know, to everyone's day, as corny as it sounds, you know, make our days better here. So keep on slinging the spells, and I'll catch you next time.